Hi and welcome. Today we're diving into one of the most remarkable chapters in our shared past. The story of how people first came together to build big cities, invent writing, and lay down some of the earliest laws and governments. And here's the twist. It didn't start in Egypt. It wasn't China either. This revolution happened in a region we now call alluvial Mesopotamia, which is in modern-day southern Iraq. Thousands of years ago, people in Mesopotamia took mud and water and used it to build sprawling cities. But here's the puzzle. Unlike Egypt, which unified under mighty pharaohs, or China, which forged dynasties that would endure for millennia, Mesopotamia never came together as a single empire or lasting civilization. It remained fragmented, a patchwork of rival city-states constantly competing for power. Over time, it ceded influence to rising powers in the north, and while its cultural and technological legacy was immense, it never became a unified, enduring force on the scale of Egypt or China. So why was that? Why didn't Mesopotamia unify and endure the way those other ancient civilizations did? In this episode, we're going to see how the land itself, its unpredictable rivers, its demanding climate, its wide open plains, made it possible for civilization to blossom, but also kept it divided. So stick with me as we head back more than 5,000 years to uncover how geography and climate both built, designed and broke the world's first urban societies. Imagine standing in a place unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. No mountains on the horizon, no forests, not even gentle hills. Just an endless, startling flatness stretching in every direction, broken only by the winding channels of two rivers. This was southern Mesopotamia, a vast, flat plain built up over thousands of years by the Tigris and Euphrates. As these rivers made their way down from the Anatolian mountains, they brought with them a dense load of fertile silt. With each flood, they spread this rich mud across the land, slowly raising the plain and creating soil that could support life. But the same process that made the land so fertile also made it unstable. Unlike Egypt's gentle, predictable Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable and fierce. Their floods often struck without warning. Not every year, sometimes not for decades, but when they did, they struck hard, engulfing settlements and smashing everything in its path. Then just as suddenly, the rivers would retreat, leaving behind deep layers of silt and clay. Over time, these deposits caused the riverbeds to rise, until the rivers sat higher than the surrounding ground. And eventually, the rivers would break their banks and carve new paths, sometimes shifting miles away in a single season. A village that once stood safely on the water's edge could be left dry and isolated, will suddenly find itself underwater. This was never an easy place to live. Southern Mesopotamia was a land of remarkable fertility, but it came at a cost. It demanded constant vigilance and relentless work. The very forces that made life possible here were also the sources of constant risk. Unlike other fertile regions that could rely on seasonal rains, Mesopotamia received almost no rainfall. Every settlement depended entirely on the waters of the Tigris or Euphrates. Each harvest, each mouthful of food, every sign of life was tied to those rivers. And it wasn't only the rivers that were unpredictable. The Persian Gulf reached much further inland than it does today. Much of southern Mesopotamia was a watery maze of swamps, salt flats and shifting floodplains. Less a stable landscape, more a restless delta. This was the world where the first urban societies grew out of, a landscape that promised abundance, yet offered no guarantees. But nevertheless, early settlements began to organise themselves. Faced with rivers that could give you life one year and take it away the next, communities had no choice but to work together. They dug canals and ditches, built small levees and constantly cleared away silt, all to keep precious water flowing where it was needed. This demanded cooperation. People had to agree on how water was shared, when labour was mobilised, and how to store and distribute food when harvests were good. Out of these basic, practical needs grew the first layers of social structures, rules, shared responsibilities, and ways to settle disputes. Over time, the harsh demands of this landscape did something remarkable. They pushed people together in even larger and more organised communities, the first true large cities. On the one hand, managing water forced cooperation on a scale that simple villages couldn't handle alone. Digging canals, clearing silt, building embankments, these weren't one-off projects. They required continuous labour, careful timing, and rules that everyone followed, season after season. As the populations began to grow and irrigation systems spread, people needed central places to plan, store surplus, settle disputes, and coordinate who did what and when. These hubs naturally grew into bigger, denser settlements, places that became the beating heart of the surrounding farmland. But on the other hand, each community's survival still hinged on its own stretch of canal and its immediate access to water. This kept settlements focused inwards, guarding their lifelines closely. Any threat to water, a neighbour's new channel upstream, a sudden shift in the river, was an existential risk. So while cooperation flourished within these growing centres, it often stopped at their edges, leaving the broader landscape divided into fiercely independent city-states. In this way, the rivers did both. They demanded complex coordination that gradually gave rise to urban life, yet they also locked each settlement into a constant battle to secure and protect its own fragile share of water. The very challenges that pushed people to build the world's first cities also ensured that those cities would remain fragmented, wary of their neighbours, and often at odds. Water in this unforgiving landscape was power, and the struggle for that power became relentless. The same ingenuity that allowed Mesopotamians to build sophisticated irrigation networks also turned those networks into weapons and targets. Places like Lagash and Umma, just a few miles apart, famously fought for generations over a contested border, a conflict driven by access to fertile land and implicitly the water that made it arable. Walls grew taller, armies became more organised, and temporary alliances formed only to shatter. Unlike civilisations that might consolidate power around a single geographic heartland or dominant predictable river, Mesopotamia's very lifeblood, its water, was dispersed, unpredictable, and fiercely contested. This environmental reality meant that even when powerful rulers emerged and managed to unite several cities, their empires were often fragile and short-lived. The constant threat of river shifts, resource scarcity, and the inherent autonomy built into each water-dependent city meant that true, long-term unification was an elusive dream. So while other civilizations consolidated into grand unified kingdoms and empires, Mesopotamia remained a mosaic, brilliant, ambitious, but unstable. The land that gave it life also kept it divided. As settlements grew, so did the complexity of managing them. In the early days, irrigation canals and seasonal labour were organised informally. Families and small king groups cooperated because it was the only way to survive. Everyone pitched in to dig, clear and repair. But as populations increased, canal systems expanded and fields stretched further and further from the rivers, these simple agreements weren't enough. Disputes over water use became more frequent. Who would get priority during a dry season? Who was responsible for repairing breaches? Who compensated who if a neighbour's poorly maintained canal flooded your land? To handle these problems, communities began to rely on respected local figures, elders, ritual specialists, or groups tied to the communal shrines that already served as gathering places for festivals and decisions. These people could mediate disputes, store shared grain, and organise large-scale labour beyond what any single household could master. Over time, these communal shrines evolved into more formal temple institutions. They were seen as neutral ground, trusted by different families and clans because they were dedicated to the gods that everyone in the community revered. Temples became natural places to store surplus grain, since people believed divine oversight offered protection from theft or misuse. In times of shortage, they could redistribute reserves in a way that seemed fair and carried religious legitimacy. As more wealth flowed through these sacred storehouses, things like grains, livestock, textiles and more, temples began to need administrators, record keepers and specialised workers. They became major employers and organisers of labour, directing teams to maintain canals, harvest crops, and build ever larger communal projects. So it wasn't just that people suddenly handed over power to temples, it happened gradually. As settlements grew, the local shrines that once simply hosted rituals and festivals began handling more practical matters, storing surplus grain, organising communal work, settling disputes. In a risky world, pooling resources under divine protection felt like the safest choice, and so step by step, temples became more than places of worship. They turned into economic and administrative centres, managing the vital flows of food, labour and water that no single family could oversee alone. In time, they stood at the heart of these early communities, the first institutions to coordinate life on a truly urban scale. Alongside the growing power of these temple institutions, another force began to emerge too: the rise of individual leaders, what we might call nowadays kings. But these weren't kings in the absolute sense of an Egyptian pharaoh. Early on, they often gained prominence as military figures, men who could rally a community's fighters to defend irrigation systems, guard storehouses, or push back rival settlements competing for the same fragile resources. Their authority was frequently temporary, tied to moments of crisis. But over time, this would change. As conflict became more frequent and the management of ever-expanding irrigation systems grew more complex, these leaders found ways to make their power endure. A key part of this was the clever appropriation of projects that were at least initially communal or temple-led. Canal expansions, flood defences, reservoir maintenance, all essential works had long been managed by communities or overseen by temple administrators. Increasingly, rulers began stamping their own names on these undertakings, inscribing them in stone and crediting themselves with the successes that would likely have happened anyway. By doing so, they reframed essential collective survival efforts as evidence of their unique leadership and divine favour. In a land where managing water meant managing life itself, this was a powerful narrative. It allowed kings to present themselves as indispensable, not just in war, but as the very guarantors of their people's daily existence. For Mesopotamian rulers, managing water wasn't just a practical duty, it was a cornerstone of legitimacy. Unlike the pharaohs, whose rules were seen as inherently divine, early Mesopotamian kings had to prove themselves, and what better way than by guaranteeing survival itself? By leading ambitious canal projects, repairing flood defences and expanding irrigation networks, they showed that the gods were on their side, and that they alone could secure the prosperity of the city. Archaeological finds from sites like Lagash and Nippur reveal sprawling networks of canals, repeatedly rebuilt and extended. Inscriptions credit these feats to kings, eager to frame themselves as both protectors and providers. Royal records often boast of new waterways alongside tales of conquest, presenting rulers as the essential link between divine favour, military strength, and the life-giving flow of water. But here, it's just worth pausing for a moment to see just how different Mesopotamian geography was from other early cradles of civilization. The Nile didn't just flood predictably, it carved out a long, narrow, naturally protected corridor. It offered Egypt a clear spine around which a single centralized kingdom could organically form. Or take early China, where a vast plain bounded by mountains and seas gave rise to a stable heartland that could expand outwards into this huge cohesive empire. Southern Mesopotamia offered nothing of the sort. It had no protective ring of mountains, no singular river valley forcing unity. Instead, it was a broad open floodplain with two rivers running through it, wandering unpredictably, creating marshes here one century and abandoning them in the next. Settlements emerged like islands, scattered across this shifting landscape, each one an isolated hub fighting for control over its immediate patch of water and fertile soil. This made division almost inevitable. Each city was the centre of its own delicate hydraulic world, deeply dependent on managing its own local networks of rivers and canals. Disputes with neighbours weren't just possible, they were guaranteed. Control over a canal or a reclaimed stretch of marshland could mean the difference between prosperity and collapse. And that's why intercity warfare wasn't just an occasional disruption, it was a defining feature of Mesopotamian life. We see this vividly in the generations-long conflict between Lagash and Umma, where boundary stones were erected, treaties were drafted, and then broken as soon as drought opportunity struck. These struggles were fundamentally about access to productive land, and above all, to the water that made it possible. The archaeology we have drives this point home. Massive city walls, weapons caches, layers of destruction in the archaeological strata, they all speak to a landscape shaped by constant tension. Kings, who first rose as war leaders, solidified the rule by claiming divine backing for their victories and by highlighting their canal-building feats in the same breath. It was two sides of the same coin. A strong ruler protected the city from enemies and kept the water flowing. And so while powerful leaders periodically managed to conquer neighbouring cities and build what we might call small empires in places like Ur, Kish, or under their Chaldean kings, these were usually short-lived. The same environment that demanded strong organisation also undermined lasting unity. A river changing course could strip a capital of its lifeblood. A regional drought could shatter fragile alliances. Unlike Egypt, where the stable flow of the Nile supported durable, central rule, Mesopotamia's volatile rivers and competing canal systems made lasting consolidation almost impossible. Again and again, attempts at broad unification fell back into local rivalries. Each city remained above all the guardian of its own survival, a master of its own precious hydraulic world. But there's another layer to this story. For all its agricultural abundance, southern Mesopotamia suffered a crucial deficit. It lacked almost every essential raw material needed to sustain an advanced urban society. The land produced grain, dates and reeds in plenty, enough to feed large populations, but it had no native source of stone for building, no hardwoods for construction, and most importantly, no local deposits of metals like copper or tin. Even gold, silver and precious stones had to come from very far away. This meant that to build temples and city walls, to forge tools and weapons, and to adorn themselves with the symbols of power and piety, Mesopotamia's cities had to look far beyond their own horizons. Long-distance trade wasn't a luxury, It was a structural necessity, the engine that kept urban life itself running. Unlike Egypt, which could meet much of its monumental and metallurgical needs from internal resources, Mesopotamia was intrinsically outward-facing, plugged into a vast trade network stretching from Anatolia to the Iranian plateau and as far as the Indus Valley. Here too, the rivers shaped the story. Supplies from the surrounding mountains, like timber cut from the Zagros forests or stones quarried in the highlands of Iran, could travel downriver with relative ease, carried on rafts and boats towards the Mesopotamian plains. But upstream movement, against the strong currents of the Tigris and Euphrates, was another matter entirely. It was slow, costly, and often required overland transport by donkey or caravan. This created a natural directional bias in trade, a geography that made it easier to receive goods than it was to send them back, and one that structurally limited any single city's ability to dominate the entire flow of resources. This trade network also gave rise to a powerful new class, the merchant elite. These were individuals and families who operated across hundreds, even thousands of kilometers, beyond the reach of any single ruler. While kings and temple institutions relied on these traders to acquire vital goods, they couldn't fully control them. Merchant networks moved through frontiers, not just borders, creating relationships that often transcended political divisions. This created a quiet tension at the heart of Mesopotamian power. Rulers built palaces with imported timber, and the temples were decorated with foreign stones and metals, but the means to acquire these materials lay partly in the hands of independent commercial agents. While kings issued seals and contracts, enforcement across such long distances was patchy at best. Southern cities like Ur, Eridu and Lagash became hubs in this system, linked by trade routes that stretched across the Persian Gulf and far beyond. Copper flowed in from Agan, cornelian from Aluha, and lapis lazuli ultimately from Afghanistan, often routed through these same networks. Timber, ivory and other exotic goods arrived the same way, managed not by royal emissaries, but by professional merchants, sometimes private, and sometimes tied to temple households. There's a famous clay tablet from Ur which captures this dynamic in almost comic bluntness. It records a complaint from a man named Nani to a merchant Eanasset, chastising him for delivering substandard copper and treating royal agents with open contempt. Now such a letter exists. That a palace representative could do little more than put his grievance in writing reveals just how limited royal control could be once trade moved beyond the city's immediate reach. In short, Mesopotamia's lack of essential raw materials didn't just shape its economy, it reshaped its entire civilization. The need for distant copper, stone, timber and luxury goods pulled its cities into vast trade networks, and this fostered a civilization that was deeply outward-looking and economically interdependent, yet still politically fragmented. No single city could ever monopolize the flow of vital resources, and even the strongest rulers relied on merchant networks and foreign connections that they couldn't influence. And trade also reshaped power on the inside. It enriched merchant houses and temple institutions, layering new complexities and rivalries into urban life. It brought foreign ideas, materials and artistic styles that blended into local traditions, giving Mesopotamian culture its distinctive cosmopolitan character. And by tying prosperity to faraway sources of metal, stone and timber, it made these cities profoundly vulnerable to disruption in places hundreds or even thousands of kilometers beyond their control. So in the end, trade didn't just bind Mesopotamia to the wider world, it etched the strengths and fragilities of the dependence into the very fabric of its society. This was a land connected by long-distance exchange, yet always struggling with the limits of power at home. So what does Mesopotamia's story tell us about the broader relationship between the land and the societies that rise upon it? Is geography truly destiny? This isn't just an academic question. It touches on fundamental ideas about human nature, free will, and our place in the world. For centuries, the idea that humans were masters of their own fate, entirely free agents, dominated Western thought, often rooted in religious beliefs. But as scientific disciplines like physics flourished, and the ideas of cause and effect began to proliferate, a new perspective emerged. By the 20th century, with a more secular outlook and a growing skepticism about free will, many scholars started to view human behaviour as deterministic, influenced by forces as predictable as the laws of physics. This is the intellectual climate in which environmental determinism really came to dominate, suggesting that a society's environment, its climates, its rivers, its resources, directly dictated its social, political and economic development. Take for instance the hydraulic hypothesis put forward by Carl Wittfogel. He argued that in arid regions like Mesopotamia, the very necessity of large-scale irrigation had to lead to powerful, centralized, often despotic states. His theory was a classic example of this deterministic thinking. However, more recently, there's been a significant pushback against such strong deterministic views. Much of this emerged from postmodern thought and what some might call a blank slate concept, emphasizing human agency, free will, and the idea that our circumstances don't dictate our character or society. Many contemporary scholars, reacting to what they saw as overly simplistic or even dangerous determinism, swung heavily the other way, emphasizing how human choice and cultural factors can overcome almost any environmental constraint. My own view, however, is that the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. While human agency is undoubtedly powerful, to deny any influence from our environment, our genetics, or our history, or our institutions, often feels like arrogance, a kind of human hubris. It goes against many people's instinct to admit we might be a victim of our circumstance or environment. For me, when it comes to deep historical currents, I'm inclined to put more weight on geographical determinism, perhaps a 60-40 kind of balance between environment and agency. It's crucial to remember that just as geographical determinism is at play, so too are other determinisms: economic determinism, genetic, historical, institutional. When many such powerful forces interact, it's not always straightforward as simple cause and effect. It creates a complex interwoven web. However, in the history of ancient Mesopotamia, the geographical determinism, in my view, is undeniable. Even if mixed and complex, the indelible imprint of that unique land on its political fragmentation, its administrative structures, and its very cultural identity stands as a profound testament to geography's inescapable shadow. And this shadow also defines the enduring legacy of Mesopotamia. The cradle of civilization, as we've explored today, was a place of astonishing, even paradoxical innovation. It gave us so much that forms the bedrock of our modern world. The earliest forms of writing, sophisticated legal codes, the foundational concepts of bureaucracy and kingship, and the intricate systems of trade and taxation that allowed complex urban life to flourish. We still live by many of their systems. The 60-minute hour, the sexagesimal way of dividing time and angles, began in Mesopotamia, with scribes tracking the heavens. The rules of geometry and early proofs that would one day bear Greek names were built on mathematical traditions first worked out in the floodplains of Sumer. Babylonian astronomers mapped planetary movements with methods later refined by the Greeks and Islamic scholars. Their legal thinking, that disputes could be resolved by precedent and codified rules, underpins our courts to this day. Even philosophical impulses to ask about our fate, mortality, and what it means to be human find some of its earliest expressions in Mesopotamian wisdom texts, in the epics of Gilgamesh, all born from the incredible human ingenuity required to survive and thrive in an utterly unforgiving landscape. Yet this very fragmentation didn't diminish Mesopotamia's profound influence. Perhaps, ironically, this constant competition and perpetual need to adapt to such a challenging environment even fueled its astonishing rate of innovation. From the first written words to the very concept of the city itself, Mesopotamia laid the foundations that would echo through every civilization that followed. So while Mesopotamia never forged a lasting empire like Egypt or China, it laid the intellectual and institutional groundwork that made future empires and our own modern world possible. In the end, Mesopotamia's greatest empire was not of armies or borders. It was an empire of ideas, one that outlived its own monuments and shaped the world long after its rivers changed course. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this exploration as interesting as I did, please consider liking this video. It really helps the channel grow and reach more history enthusiasts. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the past and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Leave a comment below. What surprised you most about Mesopotamia? Do you agree that geography plays such a powerful role in shaping civilization? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And most importantly, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.